Dando sequência ao nosso primeiro dia do seminário, inauguro agora o segundo painel, cujo título é The Global Circulations of Modalities of War, que conta com a presença de 3 grandes e queridos pesquisadores, professora Ana Leander. Eu vou fazer como a Mônica, vou apresentando os 3 para que a gente não tenha interrupção durante as apresentações. Então, professora Ana possui graduação em Relações Internacionais pelo Instituto de Estudos Politiques de Paris e doutorado em Ciências Sociais e Políticas pela European University Institute. Atualmente, é professora da Casa, da Pontifícia Universidade Católica do Rio de Janeiro, professora da Copenhagen Business School, team member da Copenhagen Business School, membro... Está um pouco desatualizado, né? Ah, você não está com o seu... I think it's not updated. Yeah.
It's Graduate Institute.
Tá, vou fazer aqui uma correção. É professora principalmente da PUC e do IRI. E do Instituto, do Graduate Institute em Genebra. Membro do corpo editorial do International Political Sociology, membro do corpo editorial do Security Dialogue e membro do corpo editorial do periódico Contexto Internacional aqui do IRI. Tem experiência na área de ciência política, com ênfase em política internacional. Em seguida, eu passarei a palavra à professora e minha querida amiga Mônica Hertz, que possui doutorado em Relações Internacionais pela London School of Economics and Political Science. Atualmente é professora associada do Instituto de Relações Internacionais da PUC. Tem experiência na área de Relações Internacionais, com ênfase em segurança internacional, atuando principalmente nos seguintes temas: política internacional, organizações internacionais, segurança internacional, relações internacionais da América Latina e política externa brasileira. Hoje está envolvida em uma pesquisa sobre fluxo de armas na América Latina, governança regional e política de segurança internacional brasileira. E, finalmente, vamos fechar esse grande painel com o professor Paulo Pereira, que possui graduação em Ciências Sociais, mestrado em Relações Internacionais e doutorado em Ciência Política e Política Internacional. Atualmente é professor assistente, doutor do Departamento de Relações Internacionais da PUC-São Paulo, docente permanente do Programa Santiago Dantas, de pós-graduação em Relações Internacionais, Unesp, Unicamp e PUC-São Paulo, e assistente especializado da Pró-Reitoria de Graduação da PUC-São Paulo. Dedica-se ao estudo da dimensão internacional do crime e do controle do crime no continente americano, com destaque para os seguintes temas: crime transnacional e segurança e perspectiva histórica, relação entre atores políticos e privados na governança do crime transnacional, evolução do regime internacional de proibição das drogas e suas transformações contemporâneas. Foi coordenador da graduação em Relações Internacionais da PUC-São Paulo, é editor da revista Carta Internacional e foi membro da diretoria da Associação Brasileira de Relações Internacionais. Bom, com isso, começamos, então, o nosso painel. Cada integrante tem cerca de 15 a 20 minutos. Eu estou aqui com os cartõezinhos para deixar. E, pronto, não vou mais usar o tempo para apresentações. Ana, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And I have actually prepared a PowerPoint for this, because I'm going to present something that I've worked on. And it picks up nicely where the discussion in the previous session ended. So it picks up on the issue of technologies and tracing, actually more concretely in this case, tracking, and it anchors it precisely in the way that security has moved into markets, and the state itself is profoundly commercialized. So it's about the paper that I'm going to talk to. I'm just going to give some ideas of the work I've done on this in relation to tracking technology specifically. I want to make an argument about what kind of politics of security, or if you like, of the military. I would actually prefer to speak about the military since we're all in the divide, but that's a discussion we'll have tomorrow in the workshop. I hope as many people will be there then. Here I want to talk about the kinds of security or military politics that come out of that. And I want to insist on the way that when people think about these tracking technologies and how they work and how they militarize, how they securitize, they tend to think of them as working in a very sort of cool, rational, strategic way at a distance. Verticality has become a sort of major theme in this literature. And in terms of transparencies, generating transparencies. And I make an argument that maybe they do all of that, but they also work in a different way. They work in proximity, and they play on the senses and on the effects really strongly, and they work from within, not from without. And they go in, they don't necessarily want transparency at all. And I think these kinds of changes really matter politically, because they matter for how we engage the politics of militarism and of everyday modalities of war. So this is what I'm going to, and that's why it's called sticky security, because in my point of view, this kind of security is much worse in many ways, or militarization, because it actually is from the inside rather than from the outside, and so you need to get it out of the body or something like that in a very strong sense. So that's what I want to talk about, and I'm just going to give you some snapshots. So just linking it up to the theme of this. So I talk about a very specific everyday modality of war, to cite the title of the conference we're in, and it's a modality that's sensor technologies, and sensor technologies are basically everywhere. It's technologies that in various ways measure. It used to, the sort of most classical thing would have been a GPS technology that measured location, but it's of course today all about, everyone has a fitness watch, so everyone knows that we can also measure biometrics, and we do it all the time, not only through the fitness watches, but in airports and in cameras, and I'll give some examples as we go along. And it's also about measuring things in the context, so things like heat, the cold, the chemicals, and so on. So you really can censor a lot of things, and the movement in sensor technologies, of course, is to combine the different kinds of sensors in the single technology. So that's the everyday modality that I'm talking about here. In terms of circulation, this work is all about advertising. It's about commercial circulation, the way that advertising constructs our everyday modalities of war, the way they do this. And in my work, I insist a lot on ways of studying that and what it takes to actually think about war and security in terms of commercial processes rather than in terms of what the state does. And I think that is a very, very important part of actually thinking what's happening. Because also the state, I would never say the state has disappeared from this, and in this context, of course, that would be completely ludicrous, but it is in any context. The point is rather that the state communicates and manages security much as markets do in the present. That is indeed what neoliberal forms of government are, if I might use that bombastic term, but since it happens to be a reality, it's actually quite useful, what they are all about. So that's why I've put a picture here. This is a picture from one of the very, very many trade fairs. Oh, you don't have sorry. Sorry, I'm the second point on my first slide, sorry. And the picture I just referred to, this is from something called the Security and Counter-Terror Expo in London, but the Security and Counter-Terror Expo is just one of very, very many commercial trade fairs where actually public and private actors sell their projects alongside each other, and so do universities. So universities and publishers and so on also have trade stands in these trade fairs. Like I've visited very many of them, and I'll talk about, I can talk a lot about it if anyone is interested in hearing more. And of course you also have them in Brazil, and there are more and more of them, and if there's one business that's not doing badly almost anywhere, it's this business. Okay, and then a very specific understanding, so everyday modality, circulation, and war, where war really is about the management of these technologies, but also managing your security is more and more something that's managed and thought of in terms of quasi-market governance forms. Okay, so my 3 points that I outlined before I said how this links to the conference theme. First point. Oh. Yeah. Yeah, do you realize I'm confused about this? Thank you, Jean. I knew I needed your support. Okay, so we tend to think about security of war for all kinds of good reasons, of course, as working mainly as sort of a strategic rationality from without. And when we introduce technologies into that equation, we tend to put the emphasis even more on that. Now, one of the things that's fascinated me in these trade fairs, and I can't go through all the arguments for that, is the way in which actually the advertising is not working like that at all. The advertising is not necessarily telling you that security and war will be managed rationally, strategically, and so on. It plays a lot, and that the technology somehow enhances that and uplifts that. It does quite the contrary, and this is just one example of this, which is this. This is an advertising brochure of a security company that's called Six Security, and they advertise themselves as educating the senses. As you can see here, I hope you can read the print. This is their main advertising brochure. And when you talk to people, this is not unique at all. So people who sort of explain to you that security works through sense-making. So when we say sense-making, we usually mean forms of experience that are beyond language, in excess of language, so involving things like touch, smell, hearing, seeing, and so on, that are, of course, have a link to language and can be translated into language, but they're not the same thing. And they're certainly not the same thing as the rational. So there's a long tradition for working on it. So I find this quite interesting, and of course completely different to the way that especially critical security studies presents this, but I think everyone actually also more conventional forms of military studies. Yeah, and I make this argument, I go into detail about how the senses are being involved, both in that you're constantly asked through the advertising to imagine different forms of threats and insecurities and so on. So it plays on your imagination. It also plays on embodiment. So it really grabs you. So I had the eyes, and they're constantly speaking to the way that the technologies engage not only your imagination, but actually your physical body. And of course, it's very strong as soon as you move into anything biometric. And since a lot of sensing and sensing technologies today go that way, because we use more and more biometrics in the provision of security, this is quite important. And then I draw a link to how this connects, like the common sense understandings, the shared, often inarticulate understandings of security professionals of their world. And I've done this, I make this point also, the importance of connection, but I don't have I'm going to be short on time anyway, but this is just that I do it together with a Berlin-based artist that some people here know, who made very nice collages for me, illustrating the points I'm making. And this is the first collage I actually have in the paper, and I managed to convince the journal to publish with it, so I'm really happy. Besides all my images of advertising, I also have this Berlin-based artist collages, and the way that she's building in sense-making. Why is everyone laughing? I don't know. Okay, it's not a funny theme, so we should be much more serious about that. So not only is it not strategic rational necessary, but it's also not at a distance from without, etc. Critical security studies scholars will recognize the import of verticality in critical security discussions, the way that, the idea that we manage things at a distance. Has anyone not heard this phrase? No, you know what I'm talking about. Now, when you go to the trade fairs, and I put an image here, this is obviously me myself, taking pictures in what's a characteristic. It's very interesting, the layers of reflexivities in trade fairs. So they literally pull you in, but they really want you inside, and they actually move inside very strongly. Thank you. And I give examples of this in terms of how they actually market the idea of these technologies becoming part of you as a subject. Like it's not something that you're not presented with something that's happening at a distance and so on. You're presented with something that is literally with you all the time, not only me as a researcher in the trade fair, but also the security professional and also the person who's being secure, depending on who the market is speaking to. Similarly, crowds. So the idea of managing crowds is not only about the subject, it's also about the collectivity or the collective subject or the crowd in contemporary parlance. And actually, critical security studies scholars will also be interested to know that, of course, the idea of the crowd has migrated into the commercial area. So now in the SCTX, last time I was there was a whole section dedicated to crowd management. And also, very similarly, the idea that's presented to you when you go in and talk with the companies and organizations, NATO, the London Police Board, etc., that are interested in managing crowd, their image of it is that they're actually inside the crowd. They're not somehow outside at a distance and so on. It's all about we can be present inside. And of course, similarly with space, it's really about going in, redesigning space from within rather than doing it at a distance. And again, I just love this collage artist that I collaborate with. What can I say? Finally, a lot of critical security studies has focused on transparency and the importance of transparency and the way transparency works in the management of security and war. But a lot of this actually has nothing to do with making transparent subjects or making things understandable. Quite on the contrary, there's a very, very widespread understanding among people who market, but of course also the resistance to their marketing, that what's needed is actually sort of co-presence that doesn't necessarily require you to understand everything about the thoughts of what's going on and so on. And so I put up an example here of this kind of logic at work, and this is taken from this is not a joke, this is a presentation in a very serious, it's an ACES presentation. ACES is the Association for American Society for Industrial Security, and usually they drop the American because it's now global. So they don't want me to spell out the acronym. I was actually asked when I asked them to publish something I used from their webpage to not spell out the acronym. Because they just want you to think of it as a sort of ACES, basically. It's a professional organization. So here is this guy presenting something on the duty of care, was what this presentation was about, and here comes, the duty of obedience. So basically, one of the problems with all these tracking technologies, of course, is that no one wants them. Like, you don't want to be monitored, so you take off the bracelet, you close down the phone, you leave it in the hotel, whatever. And this, of course, is a main preoccupation for the security manager. So this, of course, is part of the advertising because it's so obvious. Everyone who's spent 2 minutes with these people will know this. And so what you need to do is to require duty of obedience, because how could you possibly? But that has nothing to do, like negotiating obedience. So here we go, the general, the sort of disciplining with the whip of that beautiful woman that he actually put up. And that you're being morally responsible continuously as both as a security manager and as someone who's being secured, and that you're actually being recast. Your whole existence should actually be geared towards being a secure. It's amazing when you're working in conflict areas. So all of this has very little, it's a complete acceptance of the fact that you might have other interests and you might be a complex subject and you're really murky and so on. I'm definitely going to be there. I'm going to be ahead of time. I can't believe it. Okay, so all of this has very little to do with transparency and a lot to do with accepting the murkiness and saying, basically, I accept that I don't understand, that you're not transparent, that I cannot see through everything you do and so on. I just want to be there with you. I just want to be together, and that's good enough. Okay, which leads me to my conclusion. Can you believe this? And now how am I going to spend this entire conclusion here? Thank you. Which is, so thinking where, this is also picking up, of course, where the earlier roundtable ended. So questions of what does this entail for political agency and so on. So I think this is a very, very interesting question. Like, what does it mean when things are thoroughly diffused, decentralized, anchored in these multitude of practices that are effective rather than, I wouldn't oppose them that strictly, but basically relying very heavily on effect, imagination, and the like, working really from within you as a subject, and relying on idea of basically murkiness, non-transparency, and so on very centrally. So that, of course, has a lot of implications for how we think possibilities of resistance, but generally how we think about management of security, if we're interested in solving problems, but also if we're politically oriented more generally, how we think about the political implications. So I end on a drawing actually on feminist theories that I hope all of you know, and if not, please. Isabel Stengers, who's written quite a lot. She's actually written a book about capitalism, but she's also written about various things. And I quite like her take on resistance, where she talks a lot about the need we had earlier, the need to get away from the state, and that's of course core to States of Injury. Wendy Brown, that I know is a household name here, but other people have discovered that as well. And she insists on the importance of being willing to take risks of resisting, because of course that kind of resistance that's deeply decentralized and so on has a tendency to look rather ridiculous. And I love the way that Alg did this for me in the collage. One of the I don't know that anyone actually has a miracle solution to those kinds of resistance practices. What would they be, and so on. But Stenger introduces the idea of really. She has an article that's entitled "Learning to Laugh," and on the importance of actually learning to laugh, not only as a way of undermining power, because of course humor and laughter is a traditional way of doing that, but also as a way of laughing at oneself as someone unable to take risks, etc. So there's a reflexive part to that. Thank you very much. And I'm so glad there's so many people here. What can I say?
Thank you, Anna. Agora, Mônica, você tem de 15 a 20 minutos.
I prepared this in English, so I think I'll just do it in English. So my attempt here is to call our attention within the context of the debate on militarization, war. Where's Paulo? No, he's not here. Where's Paulo? The question that Paulo asked on civil war on one hand, terrorism on the other, and how and many of the questions that were raised in the first panel on the relation between violence and politics, and on the relationship between violence and the state of capitalism today, the relationship between the state and the state of capitalism today. My attempt is to call your attention to the fact that there is one lens that is quite crucial for us to understand all these relations, and that lens is to look at weapons. So the article I'm preparing is about weapons as absolutely crucial devices in social relations, but more specifically in our diagnosis, to use Philip's term, on the state of politics, war, militarization today. So just to start with a few figures to just call your attention to how important this is. The total value of sales of the top 100, according to CIPRI, in 2017 was $398 billion, a 2.5 increase from 2016. At the start of 2019, 9 states possessed approximately 13,865 nuclear weapons, of which 3,750 were deployed with operational forces. Nearly 2,000 of these are kept in a state of high operational alert. Last year, $1.822 billion were spent on the commercialization of weapons more generally. According to the Small Arms Survey, government-owned small arms are, of course, a major small arms owner that today covers 133 million military small arms, 22.7 million among law enforcement agencies. There are in the world, according to the Small Arms Survey, today 1.013 million small arms controlled by civilians. So this is just to put on the table a few numbers. We could go on and on to call your attention to, in order to understand social relations and the issues raised in the first panel, it is absolutely crucial to have a moment, let's say, to look at weapons as these very important devices. In order to understand the circulation of weapons in our complex world, I'm suggesting here in this article that we look at 5 different sets of rules. These are sets of rules, practices, discourses. They involved shared knowledge among a number of actors, if you want, networks of individuals and institutions, and of course, power relations. Stefano is here, so I have to say this. Power relations among these different social actors and interacting within these spheres. So, and militarism, in terms of the social and international relations that involve the preparation for the conduct of organized political violence, which I think is important to remember, obvious though it may be, is very much related to these 5 different forms of interaction. Of course, this is an analytical device, and they are related to each other. And the most interesting part, actually, of the research is to look at how they are related with each other. But I'll just start with pointing out these 5 sets of rules, if you want. The first one is the most obvious one. It's the production and administration of threat. And it's very much related to the traditional view of military activities, strategic studies, basically focused on the territorial security, focused on the state, and we have, a wide vocabulary and concepts to deal with this, and very clear logic focused on this idea that somehow the use or threat of violence can control threat. So deterrence, balance of power, security dilemma, compellence, conventional and nuclear deterrence, all these terms that we all know very much about, and that conform a whole a form of interaction involving state, involving a number of intellectuals, think tanks. So the production of knowledge that is, you could summarize as strategic studies as a form of thinking, and that pertains to a certain logic of militarism and a certain logic of circulation of weapons. To not get too much into this, but let me just give, of course, there are so many authors that we have to learn about that base their knowledge on this concept of, on this set of rules. But I just would like to call your attention to one specific author. His name is Jonathan Shimshoni. He's an Israeli strategist. And he very much based his theory, and it is very influential, on the idea that you have to maintain the reputation for the use of violence, which of course is quite important in the case of Israel. And there is a certain need for showing off the use of these weapons in order to acquire, in order for this whole logic to be able to work. The second set of rules involves norms on the constraint of the use of weapons. Now, so more generally speaking, I'm talking about the arms control and disarmament world. Again, a network of people, construction of knowledge, a whole different kind of vocabulary and categorization of weapons. And here we're talking about the idea of maintaining state security on a lower level of investment in weapons than would otherwise be the case if we didn't have this set of rules, on organizing the distribution of these weapons according to certain definitions of responsible and irresponsible actors that can or cannot produce, have access to technology, procurement, deployment. So very much, very important for this whole sphere of interaction is the idea of a division between responsible and non-responsible actors. It's very much a sphere of interaction where the idea that we need to avoid risk that arises from some sort of non-rational decision making. So, confidence building and this kind of logic. The whole idea that the distinctions of humanitarian law are very important in order to organize the circulation of weapons, things like the distinction between combatant, non-combatant. And finally, very important, particularly for the arms control and disarmament sphere in the post-Cold War world, is the whole idea of humanitarian security. And many authors have showed that this logic of control and disarmament has fed into the militarization of social interaction. Particularly, there are interesting works on the role of human security and the sort of new wave of arms control and disarmament in the post-Cold War period. I really think Anna Stavridakis' work on this is particularly interesting. Third, and this is very much related to what Anna was talking about, is market. The logic of market as a form of organizing the circulation of weapons. And here we're talking about the political economy of defense, of the defense industry, on a very peculiar relation between firms and states, because of course the defense industry is peculiar, and this literature has been discussing very much the role of the firm and the role of the peculiar relationship between firms and states, the peculiar form of competition within the market regarding these actors. And of course we have to look at other concepts such as supply chains, the military-industrial complex, the balance of payments, and again, apart from a vocabulary, networks, we have the production of knowledge on this, specific, as in the other two cases, specific journals such as the political economy. What is it called? The Journal of Defense Economics, Defense and Peace Economics. Specific. I'm mentioning these because these most people here perhaps wouldn't be dealing with. So this is a different world with a different logic, and also feeds into the process of militarization in different ways. The fourth sphere of interaction and set of rules I would like to call your attention to is the idea of technology development. And the circulation of weapons is very much intertwined with the idea of the development of technology, both by the state and by other actors. And perhaps the most famous and well-discussed concept in this area is the idea of spin-off. The idea that somehow technology develop, and the other way around also. I mean, the idea that technology flows from the civil industrial world to the military world, from the military world to the civil technological development. Many countries, such as Brazil, have been engaged in the past in projects of technological development where the idea that weapons could actually play a crucial role was very, very important. Some weapons, of course, or areas of weapon development have played a symbolic role, such as nuclear weapons, in allowing for projects of modernization and incorporation of modern technologies to different national projects. And finally, the fifth sphere of interaction that pertains very much to Paulo's work is criminality. So in this world, we're talking about the traffic, if you want, of weapons instead of the commerce of weapons. And the interesting thing about, and of course of rules, national rules and international rules that are not being respected, the 2014 a treaty on the control of conventional weapons is very much a world where the logic of arms control and disarmament and the logic of criminality are intertwined. The interesting thing about the discourse, the literature, and the policies of both organizations and states pertaining to the criminalization of weapons is that it is usually treated as part of a broader process of transnational criminalization. And not as something specific, but as part of the broader problem of drug trafficking and other forms of criminal activity. So again, you have a set of rules here, a set of networks and the production of knowledge that is quite specific. So my aim here is to call your attention to the fact that there are at least these 5 different logics, 5 different sets of rules and resources that organize the flow of weapons, and that they are very much important in terms also of conditions of possibility for the development of military and militarized forms of dealing with security, with violence, with politics more generally. It's of course impossible to understand the references that Marta made at the beginning of our conference here without understanding the flow of weapons connected to these 5 different logics in the city of Rio de Janeiro more specifically. Of course, it will be important for us to understand, and I'm not going to get into that here, how all these logics are intertwined with one another, how they all can feed into the process of militarization, and how in different contexts, both spatial and temporal, the role of each of these different logics will be more or less important, will allow for forms of inclusion and exclusion that are of a different type. So this is just, to begin our discussion on weapons. Thank you.
Moderar painel assim é fácil, todo mundo no tempo. Então, passamos ao nosso terceiro painelista, professor Paulo Pereira. Você tem de 15 a 20 minutos, talvez 21, porque elas duas cederam.
Ótimo, obrigado, Jana. Bom, queria agradecer, na verdade, pelo convite para estar aqui hoje. Agradecer a Mônica, agradecer a Jana e principalmente agradecer a Manuela, né, que é alguém com quem eu já tenho trabalhado há algum tempo em outros projetos. Aliás, Vou pedir, Jana, 1 minuto só para fazer um marketing de um projeto que eu estou junto com a Manuela. Acho que é importante divulgar. É uma revista, na verdade, um número especial sobre crime e relações internacionais, que nós dois somos editores, junto com o professor Tiago Rodrigues também, o professor Marcelo Campos, da Federal de Grande Dourados, e a revista Monções é uma revista nova, mas é uma revista que a gente entende que é uma revista promissora. Então, o deadline para mandar os artigos é dia 23 de dezembro, vocês estão todos convidados, que a gente vai fazendo trabalhos, está super convidado para poder mandar. Então, se alguém quiser mais informações a respeito desse número especial, depois a gente pode conversar um pouco mais a respeito. Então, é isso. Então, na verdade, a minha apresentação, eu acabei redigindo ela em inglês. Então, eu vou fazer essa... Não, eu passo. Então, eu vou fazer essa minha apresentação em inglês. Well, I'm presenting a team I've been working on since 2017, when I was in a postdoctorate at the University of Ottawa, Canada, researching the context of the opioid crisis in North America and the relationship between drug control, capitalist interests, in this case mainly by transnational pharmaceutical corporations, and state violence. Well, after that, I decided that it was necessary to invest in an approach that highlight the influence of capitalist interests in the war on drugs. Well, from my point of view, clearly this is a decisive contemporary modality of war that shapes our daily lives by fostering specific public security knowledge and transnational flows of security professionals. So I'd like to focus my presentation today in this approach. Well, first I'll briefly outline the traditional war on drugs approach. Certainly most of you know it. Then I will contextualize the importance of capitalist interests in the dynamics of the war on drugs, dividing it into 2 different perspectives, bringing authors and their analysis to establish an initial, and I'd say a very initial framework for each of them. And finally, I'll present some conclusions and some of my own doubts for the debate. So the literature that analyzed the international dimensions of the security drug nexus in the Americas amassed a large production over the last decades. It primarily discusses how states and their intelligence and security institutions interact to fight specific social groups identified as producers, traders, or consumers of drugs qualified as illegal, as well as the political and social repercussions of such actions, like social violence, corruption, incarceration, and so on, based, as we all know, most of the time, on different kinds of prejudice, racism, and xenophobia. Its focus in this sense is what has been conventionally called war on drugs. This expression, as we all know, refers to the United States' domestic and foreign policies since the 70s that developed, we can say it as almost a crusade against drugs, has mobilized the military and law enforcement institutions in different cities of the country, in different countries of the American continent, and elsewhere, either as cooperation or intervention. Or basically, it connects public safety and international security based on the production and transit of drugs considered illegal. Well, this literature was essential, of course, to the understanding of drug-related violence. Among its several contributions, it has made it clear that criminalization and violence related to different kinds of drugs can only be understood from an international point of view. And expanding this perspective, it's possible to argue that the multi-billion-dollar drug market is transnational and mobilizes public and private actors, both legal and illegal, who work at local, national, and global levels. Some connections among actors and drugs we can say that they are enclosed in spirals of repression and violence within scenarios of formal peace, as we have in Latin America and Brazil, in scenarios of war, and in those so-called state-building processes. Other connections between actors and drugs are enclosed in capitalist dynamics, protected by state institutions, and linked to United States agencies, such as the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. Well, considering this logic, I think it's crucial to analyze the security-drug connection from a complementary point of view, highlighting the capitalist dynamic of this process, which was first called Drug War Capitalism by Dawn Paley in her 2015 book. The idea is to propose an analytical framework of this approach, which can allow us to draw attention to how factors and motivations related to capitalism might interact with the violence of the war on drugs. So, this is not the same look over a new social fact. Right? It's an alternative perspective on the war on drugs. So, it's a new look at the same social fact. So, I start from a very revealing statement made by Foucault on punish and discipline and punish, the birth of the prison. And he writes, I quote him, the economy of illegalities was restructured with the development of capitalist society. Complementarily, it's possible to assert that national and international drug control is structured since the early 20th century with political and economic agendas, played an essential part in this economy of illegalities. So, using historical and conceptual research, I initially identified two possible perspectives to address relevant aspects of the drug war capitalism. The first one is the relationship between drug control and commodification, which has triggered a multi-billion-dollar market, both legal and illegal, around the globe, and whose major players are, respectively, transnational pharmaceutical corporations and organized crime groups. This aspect is the result of what the literature called pharmaceutical invasion since the 19th century, during which the development of the pharmaceutical industry and the medicalization of bodies and life had as its counterpart the sanctioning of a wide array of drugs and practices associated with them. The rise of the United States as one of the major global powers since the early 20th century was determinant in fostering the international drug control regime. Its preeminent role in promoting the first multilateral initiative since 1910 has made it possible the International Opium Convention, which established the global regulation of production and commercialization of morphine, heroin, and cocaine. Such proposal was, to a great extent, we can say, a response to the demand of groups within the United States for broadening the international consumer market of industrialized pharmaceutical products that were booming at the time. Hence, the policy implemented by the United States during the Second World War and part of the Cold War was decisive to establish the pillars of drug control around the country's private capital. In sum, the structuring of the US pharmaceutical industry was essential to the process, this process, and has occurred in a symbiotic relationship with the development of a legal and global drug market throughout the 20th century. It's interesting that Susanna Hayes, in her book, We Sell Drugs, The Alchemy of US Empire, call our attention to the fact that the so-called drug control, instead of a war, was institutionalized by governments through market regulations to, in fact, ensure the provision and availability of drugs. In its turn, the pharmaceutical industry, together with United Nations conventions, was decisive to draw the boundaries between the legal and the illegal circulation of these substances. In this sense, the constant reassertion that pharmaceutical corporations are the legitimate drug traders, in fact, reinforces the criminalization of groups that are out of this circuit that articulates capital and politics. In this game of power and money involving drugs, in which the illegal is the byproduct of the legal, the focus of state protection is directed on capitalist corporations, and the focus of state violence is directed on undesirable groups, both in the domestic and in the international arena. Well, this takes us to the second aspect of the drug war capitalism analytical framework, referring to the relationship between the violent mechanisms for drug control undertaken by the state security forces and private interests driven by the search for profit under the capitalist rationale. This provocative statement of Marx saying that crime produces more than the criminal, it produces different lines of criminal justice business, suggests the importance for us to consider the productivity of drug control. And by that I mean the assignment of the multi-billion public resources devoted to fight drugs related to the criminal justice system. In fact, beyond the criminal justice system, drug control employs a varied security industry in public-private partnerships in which manufacturers of weapons and surveillance technologies play an important role. The international drug criminalization process was both, we can say, inspirational to and justification for the creation of new laws and institutional capacities for its enforcement, both domestic and international. And this explains the proliferation of anti-drug agencies, the increased capacity and prerogative of law enforcement institutions for the use of violence, the multiplication of bilateral and multilateral treaties, which expanded police warrants in both scope and territory, the involvement of the military institution in drug interdiction activities, and countless other coercion mechanisms. Well, these two aspects or analytical vectors allow us to understand Painel's argument about the war on drugs as a solution to capitalism's miseries, as well as Mark Neocleo's statement in his work, A Brighter and Nicer New Life, calling the war on drugs a pacification security job. The idea of pacification refers to the colonization process, the expansion of capitalism in the West, and contemporarily to the United States war against insurgency in Vietnam, combining police and military power as a political technology to the violent production and reorganization of what is considered the ideal citizen of capitalism. Painel's research in Mexico shows that in Latin America, the most relevant dimension of these characteristics refers to the relationship between liberal privatization processes, violence, and extraction of natural resources by mining and oil transnational corporations. It refers to the spatial displacements of population and control over territories to open up new markets, new production capacities, and new resource, social, and labor possibilities. Well, the main idea here is that from the liberal order of the capital, which is an order of social insecurity, derives a security policy that mobilizes politics of fear. This fear is mostly directed against poorer and more vulnerable populations, historically stigmatized as responsible for bringing the vice of drugs to the so-called orderly society. It also builds violent transnational dynamics, connecting the domestic and international scope through their police power exercised by state security agencies, whether using the military or police forces, and legitimized by laws that ensure private property in the logics of capitalism. Well, in that sense, concluding, this very preliminary analytical framework of the war on drugs under the viewpoint of capitalism, I think broadens the possibilities of investigating the security drug connections. Maybe it can help us better understand these social political dynamics. Pacification, this concept, I think it's important in this framework. It reveals that this peace-security nexus creates an obsessive cycle based on fear and violence. This is what Foucault called peace as coded war in the context of liberal order. Also, it makes possible to assume that criminalization and regulation of drugs, both in the national and the international levels, are sides of the same coin and need to be analyzed in a connected manner. It hence brings actors and interests from the licit field to the analysis. For example, pharmaceutical corporations, but also other corporations which benefit directly or indirectly from the violence that is intrinsic to the war on drugs. Corporations that offer an array of surveillance or violence control services. Complementarily, it suggests attention to the impacts of capitalist dynamics on progressive initiatives for the regulation of drugs ongoing in the American continent. Something that I couldn't address in this presentation, but I think it's crucial and must be the focus of our attention in the years to come. For example, how the emerging cannabis industry and tobacco industry in the United States and elsewhere will influence and even shape and reshape the cannabis regulation models regarding consumption, production, harm reduction, other drug regulation initiatives, new patterns of drug enforcement, and the government's moral duty to give some kind of reparations to criminalized communities, which were the focus of the war on drugs, especially black communities. In sum, such a framework, I think, gives priority to an important modality of war that links local global violence of drug control to capitalist corporations and their profit-driven interests. Maybe this is one of the most explicit normalized violence we have in our daily lives, accepted for the defense of society. Well, I'll be happy to debate any questions you may have about this presentation. Thank you very much.